All right, so it looks like I'm live. Very cool. For this reading, I have brought a guest. This is my squid. I love my squid. And my squid will be joining us as we read Trotsky and his, what was it called again? Hold on. Right. Results and prospects. Hold on 1 second here, because before I get started, I just want to get my hair out of the way. Has anyone ever read a series of unfortunate events? Because if you've read a series of unfortunate events, you know that Violet would always put her hair back so that she could concentrate on whatever shit she needed to get done. That is how I feel. I feel like I need my hair back in order to concentrate on shit most of the time. Not always. I feel like I need my hair back. I don't actually need my hair back, but I like it sometimes. Today's one of those days where I'd really like to have my hair back before I get started on anything. So once again, so if in case, what is my hair doing? What are you doing? There, that's fine. So for anyone who doesn't know, I'm doing this because I have a very hard time focusing. I'm very easily distracted, and I get very easily off task. So, but I discovered that it was easier for me to do my reading and stuff when I felt like I was reading to someone. So the whole kind of like trick here is that I'm trying to emulate the sort of effect of reading to a person, which keeps my attention sustained. It's like, that's kind of interesting. It's like, unless there's like, if it's just me and the task at hand, I get very easily distracted. I will substitute one task for another in a series of tasks where I end up getting nothing done. And that's all pretty bad. That's not great. Not great. So, but when there is like a third, or there's something else, when there's another person around, or there's like a third thing to register my activity, then for some reason this helps me keep track of what I'm doing and not get distracted and stay on task. It's not perfect, but it's been working when I actually use this technique. Sometimes, lately I've been having a hard time. I'm supposed to be reading like every week, and I'm not. So, or like I'm like sometimes just barely reading a little bit. So clearly I'm not being very consistent, but when I do use this technique, it works very well. So if it seems kind of odd, like, what is this? Like, is this like a vlog, or is this like, why'd you all of a sudden start talking about like cooking or something? It's because this is not a well planned out and structured. This is not me making content. This is not some well planned out and structured like project. These videos is literally just me trying to focus. And if people actually see this, that's like secondary. But I have to In order for it to work, I have to believe as though somebody could see it. So it is live. It does get it does stay on my YouTube channel. And yeah, so we'll see how that goes. I don't know if people will actually like this. If anyone actually watches these. I mean, I do notice that some of my videos do get watched, but that's bizarre. Anyway, enough background chit-chat. Keep looking at me. A lot of times I've been like using it as an opportunity to also practice my makeup to like, look nice for the camera. But not today. Today I am feeling like poop. Not having a good day. But I'm still trying to do the things that I have tasked myself with doing. So here we are. And I've decided to bring my friend along with us. Okay. Let's see here. So today we are reading Leon Trotsky's Results and Prospects from 1906. Let's go ahead and start with the preface. Prefaces are always nice when they are well written because they tell you a lot about what the text is about. There are some books where you could read the preface and it's like you wouldn't even really need to read the book afterwards. Definitely not true for all books. Okay, so preface to the reissue of this work published in Moscow in 1919. The character of the Russian Revolution was the fundamental question in relation to which the various ideological trends and political organizations of the Russian revolutionary movement grouped themselves. Even in the social democratic movement itself, this question aroused serious disagreements from the moment events gave it a practical character. From 1904 onwards, these differences took the shape of two fundamental trends, Menshevism and Bolshevism. The Menshevik point of view was that our revolution would be a bourgeois revolution, i.e., that its natural consequence would be the transfer of power to the bourgeoisie and the creation of conditions for bourgeois parliamentarism. The point of view of Bolshevism, while recognizing the inevitability of the bourgeois character of the coming revolution, put forward as the task of the revolution the establishment of a democratic republic by means of the dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry. The social analysis of the Mensheviks was extremely superficial and in essence reduced itself to crude historical analogies, the typical method of educated Philistines. Neither the fact that the development of Russian capitalism had created extraordinary contradictions at both its poles, producing the role of bourgeois democracy, reducing the role of bourgeois democracy to insignificance, nor the experience of subsequent events restrained the Mensheviks from an indefatigable search for true, real democracy, which would place itself at the head of the nation and establish parliamentary and so far as possible democratic conditions for capitalist development. Always and everywhere, the Mensheviks strove to find signs of the development of bourgeois democracy, and where they could not find them, they invented them. They exaggerated the importance of every democratic declaration and demonstration, at the same time belittling the forces of the proletariat and the prospects before its struggle. So fanatically did they strive to find this leading bourgeois democracy in order to secure the legitimate bourgeois character of the Russian Revolution alleged to be required by the laws of history, that during the revolution itself, when no leading bourgeois democracy was to be found, the Mensheviks themselves undertook with more or less success to carry out its duties. Petty bourgeois democracy without any socialist ideology, without any Marxian class preparation, could not, of course, have acted differently under the conditions of the Russian Revolution than did the Mensheviks in the role of the leading party of the February Revolution. The absence of any serious social foundation for bourgeois democracy told on the Mensheviks themselves because they very soon outlived themselves and in the 8th month of the revolution were thrown aside by the class struggle. Bolshevism, on the contrary, was by no means imbued with faith in the power and strength of revolutionary bourgeois democracy in Russia. From the very beginning, it acknowledged the decisive importance of the working class for the coming revolution, but as the program of the revolution itself, the Bolsheviks limited it at first to the interests of the many millions of peasants, without and against whom the revolution could not have been carried through to the end by the proletariat. Hence their acknowledgement, for the time being, of the bourgeois democratic character of the revolution. As regards the estimation of the inner forces of the revolution and its prospects, the author at that period adhered neither to one or the other of the main trends of the Russian labor movement. The standpoint he then supported can be outlined as follows. The revolution, having begun as a bourgeois revolution as regards its first tests, will soon call forth powerful class conflicts and will gain final victory only by transferring power to the only class capable of standing at the head of the oppressed masses, namely to the proletariat. Once in power, the proletariat not only will not want, but will not be able to limit itself to a bourgeois democratic program. It will be able to carry through the revolution to the end only in the event of the Russian Revolution being converted into a revolution of the European proletariat. The bourgeois democratic program of the revolution will then be superseded together with the national limitations, and the temporary political domination of the Russian working class will develop into a prolonged socialist dictatorship. But should Europe remain inert, the bourgeois counter-revolution will not tolerate the government of the toiling masses in Russia and will overthrow the country far back from a democratic workers' and peasants' republic. Therefore, once having won power, the proletariat cannot keep within the limits of bourgeois democracy. It must adopt the tactics of permanent revolution, i.e., it must destroy the barriers between the minimum and the maximum program of social democracy, go over more and more radical social reforms, and seek direct and immediate support in the revolution in Western Europe. This position is developed and argued in the work now reissued, which was originally written in 1904 written between 1904 and 1906. In maintaining the standpoint of the permanent revolution during a period of 15 years, the author nevertheless fell into error in his estimation by contending factions of the social democratic movement. As both of them started out from the standpoint of bourgeois revolution, the author was of the opinion that the divergencies existing between them would not be so deep as to justify a split. At the same time, he hoped that the further course of events would clearly prove the weakness and insignificance of Russian bourgeois democracy, on the one hand, and on the other, the objective impossibility of the proletariat limiting itself to a democratic program. This he thought would remove the ground from under-factional differences. Having stood outside both of the two factions in the period of emigration, the author did not fully appreciate the very important circumstance that in reality, along the lines of the disagreement between the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks, there were being grouped inflexible revolutionaries on the one side and on the other elements which were becoming more and more opportunist and accommodating. When the revolution of 1917 broke out, the Bolshevik Party constituted a strong centralized organization uniting all the best elements of the advanced workers and revolutionary intellectuals, which, after some internal struggle, frankly adopted tactics directed towards the socialist dictatorship of the working class in full harmony with the entire international situation and class relations in Russia. As to the Menshevik Menshevik fashion, I wonder what that looks like. As to the Menshevik faction, it had by that time just ripened sufficiently to be able to assume, as I said before, the duties of bourgeois democracy. In offering to the public this reprint of his book at the time present, the author not only desires to explain the theoretical principles which rendered it possible for him and other comrades who for many years had stood outside the Bolshevik Party to join their fate and the fate of the party at the beginning of 1917. Such a personal explanation would not provide a sufficient reason for the reprinting of the book, but also to recall the social historical analysis of the motive forces of the Russian Revolution, from which followed the conclusion that the seizure of political power by the working class could and must be the task of the Russian Revolution, long before the proletarian dictatorship had become an accomplished fact. The fact that it is possible for us now to reissue without alteration this pamphlet written in 1906 and conceived in its fundamental lines already in 1904 is sufficient proof that Marx's theory is not on the side of the Menshevik substitutes for bourgeois democracy, but on the side of the party which actually carries out the dictatorship of the working class. This part right here, but also to recall the social historical analysis of the motive forces of the Russian Revolution, from which followed the conclusion that the seizure of political power of the working class could and must be the task of the Russian Revolution. That's very much this historical materialism kind of perspective on theory and on also, I think, what to think about when it comes to writing obviously it's a reprint, but when it comes to writing a book about this sort of thing, like there's a certain type of theoretical orientation that is present in like wording, phrasing that like that, and valuing things in such a way. The final test of a theory is experience. Irrefutable proof of our having correctly applied Marx's theory is given by the fact that the events in which we are now participating and even our methods of participation in them were foreseen in their fundamental lines from 15 years ago. As an appendix, we reprinted an article which was published in the Paris Nash Slovo entitled The Struggle for Power. This article had a polemic purpose and was a criticism of the programmatic letter addressed to comrades in Russia by the leaders of the Mensheviks. In it, we drew the conclusion that the development of class relations during the 10 years after the revolution of 1905 had yet further undermined the Menshevik hope for a bourgeois democracy, and that thereby, obviously, the fate of the Russian Revolution was more than ever bound up with the question of the dictatorship of the proletariat. In the face of the battle of ideas of all these many preceding years, one must indeed be a blockhead to speak of the adventurism of the October Revolution. Talking of the attitude of the Mensheviks to the revolution, one cannot but mention the Menshevik degeneration of Kautsky, who, in the theories of Martinov, Dan, Citrelli, now finds the expression of his own theoretical and political decay. After October 1917, we heard from Kautsky that although the conquest of political power by the working class should be regarded as the historical task of the Social Democratic Party, nevertheless, as the Russian Communist Party had failed to come to power through the particular door and according to the particular timetable fixed for it by Kautsky, the Soviet Republic ought to be handed over for correction to Kerensky, Tsereteli, and Chernov. Kautsky's reactionary, pedantic criticism must have come the more unexpectedly to those comrades who had gone through the period of the First Russian Revolution with their eyes open and had read Kautsky's articles of 1905 to 1906. At that time, Kautsky, true, not without the beneficial influence of Rosa Luxemburg, fully understood and acknowledged that the Russian Revolution could not terminate in a bourgeois democratic republic, but must inevitably lead to the proletarian dictatorship because of the level attained by the class struggle in the country itself, and because of the entire international situation of capitalism. Kautsky then frankly wrote about a workers' government with a social democratic majority. He did not even think of making the real course of the class struggle depend on the changing and superficial combinations of political democracy. I'm sorry, Squid. I'm sorry, audience, if you are there. For I have splurted liquid from my lips as I was attempting to drink a minuscule portion of coffee. How slovenly. How slobbish of me. Is that the right phrase? Slovenly? I swear that's the phrase. Hold on 1 second. Let me look this up. Yes. Messy and dirty. Interesting. Okay. Let's get back to it. At that time, Kautsky understood that the revolution would begin for the first time to rouse the many millions of peasants and urban petty bourgeoisie, and that not all at once, but gradually, layer by layer, so that then when the struggle between the proletariat and the capitalist bourgeoisie reached its climax, the broad peasant masses would still be at a very primitive level of political development, and would give their votes to intermediary political parties, reflecting only the backwardness and the prejudices of the peasant class. Kautsky understood that the proletariat, led by the logic of the revolution toward the conquest of power, could not arbitrarily postpone this act indefinitely. Because of this self-abnegation, it would merely clear the field for counter-revolution. Kautsky understood then that, once having seized revolutionary power, the proletariat would not make the fate of the revolution depend upon the passing moods of the least conscious, not yet awakened masses at any given moment, but that, on the contrary, it would turn the political power concentrated in its hands into a mighty apparatus for the enlightenment and organization of these same backward and ignorant peasant masses. Kautsky understood that to call the Russian Revolution a bourgeois revolution and thereby to limit its tasks would not mean to understand anything of what was going on in the world. Together with the Russian and Polish revolutionary Marxists, he rightly acknowledged that should the Russian proletariat conquer power before the European proletariat, it would have to use its situation as the ruling class not for a rapid surrender of its positions to the bourgeoisie, but for rendering powerful assistance to the proletarian revolution in Europe and throughout the world. All these worldwide prospects, imbued with the spirit of Marxian doctrine, were not made dependent either by Kautsky or by us upon how and for whom the peasants would vote at the elections to the so-called Constituent Assembly in November and December 1917. Now, when the prospects outlined 15 years ago have become reality, Kautsky refuses to grant a birth certificate to the Russian Revolution for the reason that its birth has not been duly registered at the political office of bourgeois democracy. What an astonishing fact! What an incredible degradation of Marxism. One can say with full justice that the decay of the Second International has found in this Philistine judgment on the Russian Revolution by one of its greatest theoreticians a still more hideous expression than in the voting of the war credits on August 4th, 1914. For decades, Kautsky developed and upheld the ideas of social revolution. Now that it has become reality, Kautsky retreats before it in terror. He is horrified at the Russian Soviet power and takes a hostile attitude towards the mighty movement of the German communist proletariat. Kautsky resembles to the life a miserable schoolmaster who for many years had been repeating a description of spring to his pupils within the four walls of his stuffy schoolroom, and when at last, at the sunset of his days as a teacher, he comes out into the fresh air, does not recognize spring, becomes furious, insofar as it is possible for the schoolmaster to become furious, and tries to disprove that spring is not spring after all, but only a great disorder in nature, because it is taking place against the laws of natural history. It is well that the workers do not trust even the most authoritative pedants, but trust the voice of spring. We disciples of Marx, together with the German workers, stand by our conviction that the spring of revolution has arrived fully in accordance with the laws of social nature, and at the same time in accordance with the laws of Marxist theory. For Marxism is not a schoolmaster's pointer rising above history, but a social analysis of the ways and means of the historic process which is really going on. I have left the text of the two works, that of 1906 and that of 1915, without any alterations. Originally, I intended to supply the text with notes which would bring it up to date, but on looking through the text, I had to renounce this intention. If I wanted to go into detail, I should have to double the size of the book, for which I have no time to present. And besides, such a two-storied book would hardly be convenient for the reader. And what is more important, I consider that the train of ideas in its main ramifications very nearly approaches the conditions of our time, and the reader who takes the trouble to get more thoroughly acquainted with this book will easily be able to supplement the exposition it gives with necessary data taken from the experience of the present revolution. Leon Trotsky, March 12th, 1919. It's like March 3rd, so this is like not that far from like over 100 years to the day. Okay, introduction. The Russian Revolution came unexpectedly to everyone but the Social Democrats. Marxism long ago predicted the inevitability of a Russian Revolution, which was bound to break out as a result of the conflict between capitalist development and the forces of ossified absolutism. Marxism estimated in advance the social character of the coming revolution. In calling it a bourgeois revolution, Marxism thereby pointed out that the immediate objective task of the revolution consisted in the creation of normal conditions for the development of bourgeois society as a whole. Marx has proved to be right, and this is now past the need of discussion for proof. The Marxists are now confronted by a task of quite another kind, to discover the possibilities of the developing revolution by means of an analysis of its internal mechanisms. It would be a stupid mistake to identify our revolution with the events of 1789 to 93 or 1848. Historical analogies by which liberalism lives and is nurtured cannot take the place of social analysis. The Russian Revolution has a quite peculiar character, which is the result of the peculiar trend of our whole social and historical development, and in which, in its turn, opens before us quite new historical prospects. Okay, I will be back. I will be back. Goodbye, squid. Whoosh. squid. I got that squid. Okay. We'll see how much longer I can continue doing this. Like I was saying, I've not been having a good day. On my own accord, yeah, I'm not going to talk about it, but I have a very bad tendency of wasting my day and then just feeling really bad about it and then like losing the motivation to do anything at all. And I hate it. But let's not go into that right now. That's not what this is about. Kind of. I mean, in some ways, maybe, but. So I'm just being goofy looking at my face. Oh, just make a bad looking face. Okay. Chapter 1, The Peculiarities of Russian Historical Development. I can already see this is going to be a big one. I'm not sure. I wonder how long. Excuse me. I wonder how loud my burp sounds on this thing. I hope it's not too gross. All right, then. If we compare social development in Russia with social development in other European countries, bracketing the latter together in respect of that which their history has in common and which distinguishes it from the history of Russia, we can say that the main characteristic of Russian social development is its comparative primitiveness and slowness. We shall not dwell here on the natural causes of its primitiveness, but the fact itself remains indubitable. Russian social life has been built up on a poorer and more primitive economic foundation. Marxism teaches that the development of the forces of production determines the social historical process. The formation of economic corporations, classes, and estates is only possible when the development has reached a certain level. A state and class differentiation, which is determined by the development of the division of labor and the creation of more specialized social functions, presupposes that a part of the population employed on immediate material production produces a surplus over and above its own consumption. It is only by alienating this surplus and non-producing classes that non-producing classes can rise and take shape. Furthermore, the division of labor among the producing classes themselves is possible only at a certain degree of development of agriculture, capable of ensuring the supply of agricultural produce to the non-agricultural population. These fundamental propositions of social development were already clearly formulated by Adam Smith. Hence, it follows that although the Novgorod period of our history coincides with the beginning of the European Middle Ages, the slow pace of economic development caused by the natural historical conditions, less favorable geographical situation, sparse population, was bound to hamper the process of class formation and to give it a more primitive character. It is difficult to say what shape Russian social development would have taken if it had remained isolated under the influence of inner tendencies only. It is enough to say that this did not happen. Russian social life, built up on a certain internal economic foundation, has all the time been under the influence, even under the pressure, of its external social historical milieu. 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 Milieu, my darling. When this social and state organization in the process of its formation came into collision with other neighboring organizations, the primitiveness of the economic relations of the one and the comparatively high development of the others played decisive parts in the ensuing process. The Russian state, which grew up on a primitive economic basis, entered into relations and came into conflict with state organizations built upon higher and more stable foundations. Two possibilities presented themselves. Either the Russian state was to succumb in its struggle with them, as the Golden Horde had succumbed in its struggle with the Moscow state, or it was to overtake them in the development of economic relations and absorb a great deal more vital forces than it could have done had it remained isolated. The economy of Russia, however, was already sufficiently developed to prevent the former from happening. The state did not break down, but started growing under the terrible pressure of economic forces. 1 second. Hmm. Okay. Thus, the main thing was not that Russia was surrounded by enemies on all sides. Thus, the main thing was not that Russia was surrounded by enemies on all sides. This alone does not explain the position. Indeed, this would apply to any other European country. Hold on. Okay. Thus, the main thing was not that Russia was surrounded by enemies on all sides. This alone does not explain the position. Indeed, this would apply to any other European country except perhaps England. In their mutual struggle for existence, these states depended upon more or less identical economic bases, and therefore the development of the state organizations was not subject to more powerful external pressure. The struggle against the Crimean and Nogai Tatars called forth the utmost exertion of effort. But this was, of course, not greater than the exertion of effort. Oh my God. Of course. How did I not see that? But this was, of course, not greater than the exertion of effort during the 100 Years' War between France and England. It was not the Tatars who compelled Old Russia to introduce firearms and create the standing regiments of Streltsy. It was not the Tatars who later on forced her to form knightly cavalry and infantry forces, but the pressure of Lithuania, Poland, and Sweden. As a consequence of this pressure on the part of Western Europe, the state swallowed up an inordinately large part of the surplus produce, i.e., it lived at the expense of the privileged classes which were being formed and so hampered their already slow development. But that was not all. The state pounced upon the necessary product of the farmer, deprived him of his livelihood, caused him to flee from the land upon which he had not even had time to settle, and thus hampered the growth of the population and the development of the productive forces. Thus, inasmuch as the state swallowed up a disproportionately large part of the surplus product, it hampered the already slow differentiation between estates. Inasmuch as it took away an important part of the necessary product, it destroyed even those primitive production bases upon which it depended. But in order to exist, what? But in order to exist, to function, and therefore, above all, to alienate the part of the social product it required, the state needed a hierarchical organization of estates. This is why, while undermining the economic foundations of its development, it simultaneously strove to force the development of these foundations by government measures, and, like any other state, strove to turn this development of estates to its own advantage. Milyukov, and the historian of Russian culture, sees this as a direct contrast to the history of Western Europe, but there is no contrast here. The estates monarchy of the Middle Ages, which grew into bureaucratic absolutism, constitutes a state form reinforcing certain definite social interests and relations. But this state form itself, once it had arisen and was in being, had its own interests, dynastic, court, bureaucratic, which came into conflict not only with the interests of the lower, but even with those of the higher estates. The dominating estates, which constituted the socially indispensable middle wall between the masses of the people and the state organization, exercised pressure on the latter, made their own interests the content of the state's practical activity. At the same time, the state power, as an independent force, also looked upon the interests of the higher estates from its own point of view. It developed resistance to their aspirations and tried to subject them to itself. The actual history of the relations between state and estates proceeded along resultant lines, determined by the correlation of forces. A process identical in fundamentals took place in Russia. The state strove to make use of the developing economic groups to subject them to its own specialized financial and military interests. The dominating economic groups, as they arose, strove to use the state to consolidate their advantages in the form of estate privileges. In this play of social forces, the resultant went much more in favor of the state power than was the case in the history of Western Europe. The exchange of services between the state power and the upper social groups at the expense of the working classes, which finds its expression in the distribution of rights and obligations, of burdens and privileges, was less advantageous to the nobility and clergy in Russia than in the medieval estates monarchies of Western Europe. This is beyond doubt. Nevertheless, it would be a great exaggeration and contrary to all sense of proportion to say that while in the West the estates created the state, in Russia the state power created the estates in its own interests, as Milyukov does. Sometimes I wonder if I'm doing something weird with my voice, something wrong with my voice, because I always seem to be making mucus, or maybe that's just me, and I have this tick with whatever is going on with my throat, and so I'm whatever, some bullshit like that. I'm sorry. That was uncalled for. Uncalled for silliness. Uncalled for silly goose behavior on my part. Let's stop playing with water in my mouth and get back to the reading. States cannot be created by state action, by law. Therefore, one or another social group can take shape as a privileged state with the help of state power. It must have developed economically with all its social advantages. Estates cannot be manufactured according to a previously established scale of ranks or according to the code of the Légion d'honneur. The state power can but assist with all its resources the elementary economic processes which brings forward higher economic formations. As indicated above, the Russian state consumed a comparatively large share of the forces of the nation, thus hampering the process of social crystallization. But it needed this process for its own purposes. It is natural, therefore, that under the influence and the pressure of its more differentiated Western milieu, a pressure that was transmitted through the military state organization, the state in its turn strove to force the development of social differentiation on a primitive economic foundation. Therefore, the very need for forcing, caused by the weaknesses of the social economic foundation, made it natural that the state in its efforts as guardian should have tried to use its preponderant power to direct the very development of the upper classes according to its own discretion. But on the way to the achievement of great success in this direction, the state first found itself balked by its own weakness and primitive character of its own organization, which was due, as we have seen, to the primitiveness of the social structure. Thus, the Russian state, erected on the basis of Russian economic conditions, was being pushed forward by the friendly and even more by the hostile pressure of the neighboring state organizations, which had grown up on a higher economic basis. From a certain moment, especially from the end of the 17th century, the state strove with all its power to accelerate the country's natural economic development. New branches of handicraft, machinery, factories, big industry, capital were, so to say, artificially grafted onto the natural economic stem. Capitalism seemed to be an offspring of the state. From this standpoint, it could be said that all Russian science is the artificial product of government effort, an artificial grafting on the natural stem of national ignorance. Russian thought, like the Russian economy, developed under the direct pressure and hold on. Russian thought, like the Russian economy, developed under the direct pressure, the higher thought and the more developed economies of the West, since owing to the natural economy character of economic conditions, i.e., the poor development of foreign trade relations with other countries. I don't know why I'm messing up on these sentences. It's so bad. But I am, and we're starting over. From the beginning. I'm fully starting this chapter. No, I'm joking. Could you imagine? God, that would be awful. Russian thought, like the Russian economy, developed under the direct pressure the higher thought and more developed economies of the West. Since, owing to the natural economy character of economic conditions, what exactly does that mean? I don't know. I.e., the poor development of foreign trade. Relations with other countries bore a predominantly state character. The influence of these countries found expression in fierce struggles for the existence of the state before expressing itself in direct economic competition. Western economies influenced Russian economies through the intermediary of the state. In order to be able to survive in the midst of better armed, hostile countries, Russia was compelled to set up factories, organize navigation schools, publish textbooks on fortification, etc. But if the general course of the internal economy of this enormous country had not been moving in the same direction, if the development of economic conditions had not created the demand for general and applied science, all the efforts of the state would have been fruitless. The national economy, which was naturally developing from natural economy to money commodity economy, responded only to those measures of the government which corresponded to its development, and only to the extent that they corresponded to it. The history of Russian industry, of the Russian currency system, and of state credit are the best possible evidence for the above opinion. Hmm. So then there's a quote. The majority of the branches of industry, metal, sugar, petroleum, distilling, even the textile industry, writes Professor Mendeleev, were originated under the direct influence of government measures, sometimes even with the help of large government subsidies, but especially because the government always consciously followed the policy of protection. In the reign of Alexander, the government frankly inscribed this policy to its banner, the higher government circles, fully accepting the principles of protection in application to Russia, proved to be more advanced than our educated classes as a whole. The learned panegyrist of industrial protection forgets to add that the policy of the government was dictated not by any concern to develop industrial forces, but purely by fiscal and in part military technical considerations. For this reason, the policy of protection was often opposed not only to the fundamental interests of industrial development, but even to the private interests of various groups of businessmen. Thus, the cotton mill owners openly declared that the high duties on cotton were being maintained not with the view to encouraging cotton growing, but exclusively for fiscal interests. As the creation of estates, as in the creation of estates, the government was pursuing above all the aims of the state, so also in planting industry. Its main concern was directed towards the requirements of the state exchequer, What? I've never seen this word in my life, and so I must find out what it means. A royal or national treasury. How surprising. I'm just joking. Very unsurprising. That's kind of what I thought. Kind of want to scream into my squid. Sorry. The learned Panir. No, that's not where he's left off. There is no doubt, however, that the autocracy played no small part in transplanting the factory system of production to the Russian soil. While exploiting the country to the utmost by means its fiscal and military machine, the government brought its yearly budget up to the huge figure of 2 milliard rubles. I'm just sitting here burping like a fucking gross ass. How's that for content? Big ol' sigh. I guess that's part of what's funny about this live stream, or what's interesting is it's really not content. It's really not content. There is nothing about what I'm doing right now that is like good content. I don't think so. I think what I'm doing right now is basically just kind of goofy. Kind of goofy like me. Let's see here. At the moment when developing bourgeois society began to feel a need for the political institutions of the West, the autocracy proved to be armed with all the material might of the European states. It rested upon a centralized bureaucratic machine, which was quite useless for establishing new relations, but was able to develop great energy in carrying out systematic repressions. The enormous distances of the country had been overcome by the telegraph, which imparts confidence to the actions of the administration and gives relative uniformity and rapidity to the proceedings in the matter of repressions. The railways render it possible to throw military forces rapidly from one end of the country to the other. The pre-revolutionary governments of Europe hardly knew railways and telegraphs. The army at the disposal of absolutism was colossal, and if it proved useless to the serious trials of the Japanese War, it was nevertheless good enough for internal domination. Not only the government of France before the Great Revolution, but even the government of 1848 knew nothing similar to the Russian army of today. While exploiting the country to the utmost by means of its fiscal and military machine, the government brought its yearly budget up to the huge figure of 2 milliard rubles. Supported by its army and its budget, the autocratic government made the European Stock Exchange its national treasury, and the Russian taxpayer thus became a hopeless tributary of the European Stock Exchange. Thus, the 80s and 90s of the 19th century, the Russian government confronted the world as a colossal military, bureaucratic, and fiscal stock exchange organization of invincible power. The financial and military might of the absolute monarchy overwhelmed and blinded not only the European bourgeoisie, but also Russian liberalism, which lost all faith in the possibility of trying conclusions with absolutism in an open measurement of strength. The military and financial might of absolutism seemed to exclude any chance whatever for the Russian Revolution, but in reality, just the opposite proved to be the case. The more a government is centralized and the more independent it is of society, the sooner it becomes an autocratic organization standing above society. The greater the financial and military forces of such an organization are, the longer and more successfully it can continue its struggle for existence. The centralized state, with its budget of 2 milliards, its debt of 8 milliards, and its army of many millions of men under arms, could continue to exist long after it ceased to satisfy the most elementary needs of social development. Not only the needs of internal administration, but even the needs of military security, for the maintenance of which it was originally formed. The longer such a state of affairs dragged on, the greater became the contradiction between the needs of economic and cultural development and the policy of the government, which had developed its mighty Millard-fold inertia after the epoch of the great patchwork reforms, which not only did not eliminate these contradictions, but on the contrary, for the time vividly revealed them, had been left behind. Okay. That's a weird sentence. Hold on. Let me get back to that. Let's see. The longer such a state of affairs dragged on, the greater became the contradiction between the needs of economic and cultural development and the policy of the government, which had developed its mighty milliard-fold inertia after the epoch of the great patchwork reforms, which not only did not eliminate these contradictions, but on the contrary, for the first time vividly revealed them, had been left behind, it became ever more difficult and psychologically ever more impossible for the government voluntarily to take the path of parliamentarism. The only way out of these contradictions, which its situation indicated to society, was through the accumulation of sufficient steam within the boiler of absolutism to burst it. Thus, the administrative, military, and financial power of absolutism, thanks to which it could exist in despite of social development, not only did not exclude the possibility of revolution, as was the opinion of the liberals, but on the contrary, made revolution the only way out. Furthermore, this revolution was guaranteed in advance in all the more radical character in I'm losing track of what I'm reading. Hold on. Thus, the administrative, military, and financial power of absolutism, thanks to which it could exist in spite of social development, not only did not exclude the possibility of revolution, as was the opinion of the liberals, but on the contrary, made revolution the only way out. Furthermore, this revolution was guaranteed in advance and all the more radical character in proportion to the great might of absolutism dug an abyss between itself and the nation, as the great might. Yeah. Russian Marxism can justly be proud of having alone explained the direction of this development and foretold its general forms, while the liberals fed themselves on the most utopian practicalism, and the revolutionary Narodniki lived on phantasmagoria and a belief in miracles. The entire preceding social development made revolution inevitable. What then were the forces of this revolution? What indeed? Okay, I'll be back. Okay, let's keep going. Let's keep going. Hold on. All right. Okay, I think I'm finally ready to start again. Oh my God. Oh, I hate myself. I said, you know what's funny? This morning, I was laying in bed and I was over worrying, I guess, about stuff. I was just worrying about the different things that I wanted to do today and how I felt kind of overwhelmed by just all the different things I wanted to try to get done. Actually, it wasn't that many things. It was just I had a lot of different things on my mind, I guess, maybe that's more accurate. And I was worrying about some stupid stuff with like a Kickstarter thing that I'd been a part of a long time ago and that I never got resolved. And I was upset about how I wanted to do this. What I'm doing right now is doing this reading, and then I wanted to look over my senior thesis because I might be doing a presentation on it if I can submit it in time and if I feel confident about doing that. And also I wanted to exercise. I feel like I haven't been getting enough exercise in lately. I really want to try to do that. So I was like really just like worrying about shit and being overly overwhelmed. Not overly anything, just overwhelmed. And I said something like, I hate life. And then my fiance turns to me, who's like half asleep, and she's like, it's all right. I don't think I think life is pretty indifferent to you. And I'm like, that's not good enough. I need life to care. I need life to be upset that I hate it. Life needs to be upset that I hate it. Life has to care that I hate life. Oh, man. But then again, it's not that I really hate life. I hate my life sometimes. And my life, can my life feel bad that I hate? No, only me. I'm the only one who can feel bad from hating my life, unfortunately. So, anyway, part 2. Towns and capital. Let's see here. Urban Russia is the product of very recent history, more precisely of the last few decades. At the end of the end of the reign of Peter I in the first quarter of the 18th century, the town population numbered somewhat more than 328,000, i.e., about 3% of the total population of the country. At the end of the same century, it amounted to 1,301,000, about 4.1% of the total population. By 1812, the urban population had risen to 1,653,000, which was equivalent to 4.4% of the total population. By the middle of the 19th century, it was still no more than 3,482,000, which was 7.8% of the total. Finally, according to the last census, the population of the towns numbered 16,289,000, i.e., about 13% of the total population. If we consider the town as a social economic formation and not merely as an administrative unit, we must admit that the above figures do not give a true picture of urban development. The history of the Russian state shows us numerous instances where charters were granted to or withdrawn from towns for reasons which were far from scientific. Nevertheless, these figures do clearly show the insignificance of the towns in pre-reform Russia and their feverishly rapid growth during the last decade. According to the calculations of Mikhailovsky, the increase in the urban population between in 1885 and 1887 was equivalent to 33.8%, i.e., more than double the increase in the population of Russia as a whole, 15.25%, and nearly 3 times the increase of the rural population, 12.7%. If we add to this the industrial villages and hamlets, the rapid growth of the urban, in the sense of non-agricultural population, appears more clearly still. But the modern Russian towns differ from the old ones not only in the number of their inhabitants, but also in their social type. They are centers of commercial and industrial life. The majority of our old towns played hardly any economic role. They were military and administrative centers or fortresses. Their inhabitants were employed in one or another form of state service and lived at the expense of the national treasury. In general, the city was an administrative, military, and tax collecting center. When a non-service population settled within the precincts of the town or in its outskirts for protection against enemies, this did not in the slightest degree interfere with their continuing with their former agricultural pursuits. Even Moscow, the largest town in Old Russia, was, according to M. Milyukov, simply a royal manor, a considerable portion of the population of which was connected in one way or another with the court, either as members of the suite, as guards, or as servants. Out of over 16,000 households, according to the census of 1701, not more than 7,000, that is 44%, were settlers and craftsmen, and even these lived in the state suburb and worked for the palace. The remaining 9,000 belonged to the clergy and the ruling estate. Thus, the Russian towns, like the towns under the Asiatic despotisms, and in contrast to the craft and trading towns in European Middle Ages, played only the role of consumers. In the same period, the towns of the West more or less successfully established the principle that craftsmen had no right to live in the villages, but the Russian towns never strove after such aims. Where then the manufacturing industry and the crafts? Where then were manufacturing industry and the crafts? In the country, attached to agriculture. The low economic level, with the intense depredation of the state, did not permit any accumulation of wealth or social division of labor. The shorter summer in comparison with the West allowed a longer winter leisure. Owing to these factors, manufacturing industry was never separated from the agricultural and was not concentrated in the towns, but remained in the countryside as an occupation auxiliary to agriculture. When in the second half of the 19th century, capitalist industry began to develop widely, it did not encounter any urban crafts, but in the main, only village handicraft. I actually have no idea what I just read. So hold on, I'm going to reread that because I'm not satisfied with that kind of lack of retention. The low economic level, with the intense depredations of the state, did not permit any accumulation of wealth or social division of labor. The shortest summer in comparison with the West allowed a longer winter leisure. Owing to these factors, manufacturing industry was never separated from agriculture and was not concentrated in the towns that remained in the countryside as the occupation auxiliary to agriculture. When in the second half of the 19th century, capitalist industry began to develop widely, it did not encounter any urban crafts, but in the main, only village handicraft. For the 1.5 million factory workers at the most that are in Russia, writes M. Milyakov, there are still not less than 4 million peasants engaged in domestic manufactures in their own villages, who continue to carry on at the same time their agricultural occupations. This is the very class from which the European factories arose, but which did not in the slightest degree participate in the setting up of Russia's factories. Of course, the further growth of the population and its productivity created a basis for the social division of labor. This naturally applied also to the urban crafts. As a result, however, of the economic pressures of the advanced countries, this basis was seized by large scale capitalist industry, so that the town handicrafts had no time to develop. The 4 million rural craftsmen comprised the very element which in Europe formed the nucleus of the town population, entered the guilds as masters or journeymen, and subsequently found themselves more and more left outside the guilds. 4 million rural craftsmen comprised the very element which in Europe formed the nucleus of the town population, entered the guilds as masters or journeymen, and subsequently found themselves more and more left outside the guilds. It was precisely the craftsman class that constituted the bulk of the population in the most revolutionary quarters of Paris during the Great Revolution. This fact alone, the insignificance of our urban crafts, had immeasurable consequence for our revolution. The essential economic feature of the modern town lies in the fact that it works up raw materials supplied by the country. For that reason, conditions of transport are decisive for it. Only the introduction of railways could so greatly widen the source of supply for the town as to make it possible to concentrate such large masses of people. The necessity for concentrating the population arose out of the growth of large factory industry, the nucleus of the population of a modern town, at least of a town possessing some economic and political significance, is the sharply differentiated class of wage workers. It was this class, as yet substantially unknown during the period of the Great French Revolution, which was destined to play the decisive role in our revolution. The factory industrial system not only brings the proletariat to the forefront, but also cuts the ground from under the feet of bourgeois democracy. In previous revolutions, the latter found its support in the urban petty bourgeoisie, craftsmen, small shopkeepers, etc. Another reason for the disproportionately large political role played by the Russian proletariat is the fact that Russian capital is to a considerable extent of foreign origin. This fact, according to Trotsky, resulted in the growth of the number, strength, and influence of the proletariat being out of proportion to the growth of bourgeois liberalism. As we have said above, capitalism in Russia did not develop out of the handicraft system. It conquered Russia with the economic culture, the world of Europe behind it, and before it, as its immediate competitor, the helpless village craftsman or the wretched town craftsman. And it had the beggared peasantry as a reservoir of labor power. Absolutism assisted in various ways in fettering the country with the shackles of capitalism. Okay. In the first place, so I was talking about the ways that absolutism assisted in fettering the country at the shackles of capitalism. So, in the first place, it converted the Russian peasantry into a tributary of the stock exchanges of the world. The absence of capital within the country and the government's constant need for money created a field for usurious foreign loans, from the reign of Catherine II to the ministry of Wit and de Novo. The Amsterdam, London, Berlin, and Paris bankers systematically strove to convert the autocracy into a colossal stock exchange speculation. A considerable part of the so-called internal loans, i.e., loans realized through the home credit departments, were in no way distinguished from foreign loans because they were in reality placed with foreign capitalists. Proletarianizing and pauperizing the peasantry by heavy taxation, absolutism converted the millions of the European stock exchange into soldiers and battleships, into prisons and into railways. The greater part of this expenditure was, from the economic point of view, absolutely non-productive. An enormous share of the national product was sent abroad in the form of interest, and enriched and strengthened the financial aristocracy of Europe. The European financial bourgeoisie, whose political influence in parliamentary countries during the last 10 years has grown uninterruptedly and has forced the commercial and industrial capitalists into the background, converted, it is true, the Tsarist government into its vassal, but it could not and did not desire to become a component part of the bourgeois opposition within Russia. It was guided in its sympathies and antipathies by the principle formulated by the Dutch bankers Hop and Company. In the conditions for the loan to Tsar Paul in 1798, interest must be paid irrespective of political circumstances. The European Stock Exchange was even directly interested in the maintenance of absolutism, for no other government could guarantee such usurious interest. State loans, however, were not the only means whereby European capital was imported to Russia. The very money payment of which absorbed a good part of the Russian state budget returned to the territory of Russia in the form of commercial industrial capital attracted by the untouched natural wealth of the country, especially by the unorganized labor power, which so far had not been accustomed to put up any resistance. The latter period of our industrial boom of 1893 to 99 was also a period of intensified immigration of European capital. Thus, it was capital which, as before, remained largely European and which realized its political power in the parliaments of France and Belgium that mobilized the working class in Russia. By economically enslaving this backward country, European capital projected its main branches of production and methods of communication across a whole series of intermediate technical and economic stages through which it had to pass in its countries of origin. But the fewer obstacles it met with in the path of its economic domination, the more insignificant proved to be its political role. The European bourgeoisie developed out of the third estate of the Middle Ages. It raised the standard of protest against the village, and violence was blah, blah, blah. It raised the standard of protest against the pillage and violence carried on by the first two estates in the name of the interests of the people which it itself desired to exploit. The estates monarchy of the Middle Ages, in its process of conversion into bureaucratic absolutism, relied on the population of the towns in its struggle against the pretensions of the clergy and nobility. The bourgeoisie made use of this for its own political elevation. Thus, bureaucratic absolutism and the capitalist class developed simultaneously, and when these two came into conflict in 1789, the bourgeoisie proved to have the whole nation behind it. Russian absolutism developed under the direct pressure of Western states. It copied their methods of government and administration much earlier than economic conditions here permitted the rise of a capitalist bourgeoisie. It already dispossessed a tremendous standing army, or it already disposed of a tremendous standing army and a centralized bureaucratic and fiscal machine, and had entered into irredeemable debt to the European bankers at a time when the Russian towns still played an absolutely insignificant economic role. Capital intruded from the West with the direct cooperation of absolutism, and in a short period converted a number of old archaic towns into centers of trade and industry, and even created in a short time commercial and industrial towns in places that previously had been absolutely uninhabited. This capital frequently appeared in the form of large impersonal shareholding companies. During the 10 years of the industrial boom of 1893 and to 1902, the total share capital increased by 2 million rubles, whereas during 1854 to 92, it had increased by only 900 millions. So is a milliard more than a million? Because I thought they were kind of the same thing. Guess I was wrong. I mean, maybe this is a peculiar Russian peculiarity, but what is a milliard? What is a milliard? Because 900 million being less than 2 milliard, that seems weird. Oh, okay. A millard is a British term for 2,000 million. Damn. All right. The proletariat immediately found itself concentrated in tremendous masses. Well, between these masses, the autocracy, there stood a capitalist bourgeoisie, very small in numbers, isolated from the people, half foreign, without historical traditions, and inspired only by the greed for gain. Yeah. So I'm done for today. Yeah, I'm done for today. I'm done. It'd be nice to have gotten more done, but this is where I'm at. This is I have other things I need to do today. Unfortunately, I can't just read all of this today. I don't know how much of this I'm going to get done, but it's okay. I'm going to read some tomorrow too, so that'll be good. But yeah, so I don't know. We'll see what happens. All right. So, that's that. Say goodbye to my squid. My squid will say goodbye to you. Bye-bye. I was like, I can't do that. I'm trying to make it look like the squid is talking, but it's not working. Bye-bye. No, I'm failing at this. I clearly need to go back to puppetry school or something because I'm not doing a good job. Anyways, that's it for me for right now for this, and I'm gonna go ahead and close out and probably go to the gym before doing some other stuff. And anyway, if you've been watching this for some godforsaken reason, if somehow you made it to the end of this, which I don't know how to applaud you or be like, what's wrong with you? Then cool, thank you for hanging out with me, sort of in this weird disassociated fragmented sense of time and space. Because I know no one watched this while it was live. Just absolutely not the case. But anyway, hope you have a good day. I'm going to try to have a better rest of the day than I did earlier today. But all right. Goodbye. Oh, yes. There we go.